How are we, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to Small Kind Ding Repairs. We have a challenging one today. The best kind of surfboard is a fish, and today we have a fish. We have this green Jim Z in for repair, and the owner of this board was out surfing one of our local beaches, and according to him, some blow-in dropped in on him, causing some pretty severe damage to his board, and then he created more damage to his board when he picked the board up and smashed the other guy's board right there on the rail. So something that I really approve of as a ding repairer is if somebody breaks your board, be sure to break their board as well, because then I get twice as much work. So that is exactly what happened in this case. That was from the collision. This big gouge here was from the collision, and then our rail damage on that left rail, that was from my customer's attempt at putting a hole in the offender's board. Apparently though, the offender's board was still undamaged after being smashed with this part of this Jim Z fish. So whatever board the offender was riding, strong construction by the sounds of it. There's about 7 years worth of wax on this board as well. This board actually came in for tail repairs some years ago, and I think the board hasn't been de-waxed and started over since then. But at least it's not full of sand, so I'm okay with it. There is some other damage around the place, so there's a small crack here, and underneath this ding tape just here, there's some kind of crack. So we'll peel that off and have a look. Our tail point has also been opened up on this side, and it looks like that side as well. So we'll be dealing with all of that with this one. This one's going to be quite a challenging fix, not because of the color so much, but because of the texture of the paint. So people do talk a lot about color matching. That seems to be a big focus with repairing surfboards, but something that's overlooked quite often is texture of the paint. Now this board has been sprayed directly to the blank before glassing, so you kind of end up with this almost dry kind of texture where the paint meets the foam. And then to make things worse, there is of course a fade there from a darker green to a lighter green, possibly the same green but just a lighter paint job, and that's created this kind of bumpy texture that you see here, which is going to be very hard to mimic. Our split in the board is quite large. It's about the length of my hand, and it's been dented quite severely, so we're going to have to remove quite a bit of glass here to fill this area with foam, which means we're going to have quite a large area to paint to try and sort of hide our repair, and especially trying to match this sort of dry texture that this board has. So it's definitely going to be a challenge, this one. Not so much the repair, that'll be pretty straightforward, but hiding that repair is going to be difficult. So let's see how we do. Now, before you jump down there in the comments and start having a go at me for encouraging other people or my customers to break other people's boards, I was just joking. I promise you, I was just joking. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a big fan of regulation out in the water for sure. I think there needs to be more of it, especially these days, but I'm not a big fan of localism, and I'm not a big fan of violence in the surf, especially on the average day around here where it's gonna be waist to shoulder height and pretty soft waves anyway. Now the second area that's going to definitely need foam inserted is where we've lost our fin plugs. But our fin plugs are actually full of resin still. The plugs have just pulled clean out of the resin and left it all behind. So we need to remove all of that old resin out of the holes first, so that we're getting a foam to foam bond and not a foam to resin bond. I think quite often people mistake localism for regulation, but I don't believe they're the same thing at all. I don't care where you're from, whether you've lived here for your whole life or whether you've been here for one day. It doesn't matter to me. I don't think anyone should be more allowed to break, I guess, the etiquette or the rules around surfing regardless of where they're from. It makes no iota of difference to me. And although I don't approve of violence in the surf, or anywhere else for that matter, I don't want anyone to be hurt or have a bad time like that, it is an interesting question of, well, how do you regulate without the threat of violence? Because the threat of violence really is why people are paranoid and act right, I suppose, in certain situations, including out in the surf. So I guess if I'm pro-regulation, I'm pro-threat of violence, but I'm not pro-violence. While we don't need to sand in order to do our foam pours, we're going to sand this rail here because the glass is kind of squishy and soft. So we're going to give it a really hard sand first and see how much of that glass kind of needs to come away. And then that's going to dictate whether or not we need to pour foam in this area as well, or whether we'll be able to get it smooth enough just to kind of laminate over it and continue on from there. So this bit of fiberglass on the bottom side has a little bit of movement, as you can see. So it may need to be cut away and the foam underneath may be dented, which is going to mean it needs replacing. So let's give it a sand and see what we're left with. And I'm not necessarily talking about an actual threat of violence, like, hey, I'm going to kick your ass, but more that I think people are innately aware that situations can potentially lead to violence, and so I think we all try to avoid that in our everyday lives, in almost every interaction we have, at all costs, because we know subconsciously that there is that underlying threat of violence from other people. And that doesn't have to be verbally spelt out for us, it's just something that we all know is a potential in day-to-day life. So with all that loose, damaged glass removed, you can see the rail is pretty munted, so in order to reshape that, we are going to pour foam in it. Our only other choice would be to fill the area with resin and micro balloons and shape that, but as we've discussed over the years now with this YouTube channel, that is not the way we do things around here. We don't want to be adding a really hard, dense material against this soft, porous, flexible foam. We're just going to give everything a wipe down just to make sure our masking tape sticks for our foam pour. It's not so much about dust or the foam or anything like that. We just want our masking tape to hold on nice and tight. Let's go mask up and pour some foam. Now the beauty of this job is that all of our foam pours are going to take place on the same side of the board. So we'll get them all poured right now in one, and then tomorrow we'll be ready to sand and move on to resin work, as opposed to a lot of jobs which needs a foam pour on this side and then flip the board over, mix more, do the pour on the other side. So we're just going to get it all done in a pour. As well as pouring foam in here, and in here, we also have this board over here, which lost both of its fin boxes, so we're going to pour foam in that as well. So as we learnt from the series that finished recently, a week's worth of board repairs, we work all of our boards in batches together so that we can split materials across multiple jobs. I can give you an example of this. So about 15 years ago-ish, I stayed in Hawaii for the first time I'd ever been there.
Well, I'm going to Hawaii to surf the big waves from North Shore!
I stayed there for 3 months, and I went there as a downhill skater primarily, so I was staying in a skate house with a buddy called Ethan. But one day he took me out surfing on a small day at Ala Moana Bowls. And I wasn't a surfer back then, so I'd surfed as a kid, you know, but I didn't know any of the rules or the guidelines or anything like that. But I certainly found them out pretty quickly that day. We are back the next day, and our little loaves of bread have risen and are cured. So to keep you guys happy, we're going to cut the tops off of these and sand them all to shape, and then probably move on to the other damage, get all that prepped as well. Then we can mix up some sanding resin, seal all of those cracks on the tail, and screed our little loaves of bread, our foam, once it's all sanded. So I paddled on out through the dock with the buddy Ethan, and we made it out to the lineup, and there were maybe 6 other guys. I'm going to tell you that they were Dahui. I don't know that for sure, but there were 6-ish other local guys out there, and then me and Ethan.
Oh, surf looks good, huh, Vince? Plenty of Holly surfers, but we'll blow them away, bro.
Whatever's. We go.
So this is something quite common that you'll face. Our foam is now, in theory, sanded flush, but you can see here there is a high spot. So when those plugs have pulled out, they've actually lifted the glass up here and here. So we need to keep sanding this until it's all flat and sanding evenly with the disc of the sander. You can see right here that our sanding pad is sanding there, it's sanding here, it's sanding here, but it's not able to sand these areas because it's being held up by these high spots. So we need to get those high spots down flat with this and this and this. So I was in like my early 20s maybe, little skate rat, kind of surfing for the first time in a very long time, no idea what I was doing. From memory, the waves were maybe like head height, thereabouts, and I couldn't read the swell or the wave direction or anything like that. So my buddy Ethan was telling me every time a wave rolled in, go, 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 paddle, 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 go, 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 as you do, you know. And so every time he would tell me to go, 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 paddle, 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 I would go, 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 paddle, 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 and then inevitably I would go over the falls and eat shit, which is to be expected. So I have no idea how long I was out there doing that for, but because of my lack of paddle fitness, it felt like forever. And then next minute I turn around and I was surrounded by the brothers.
Hey, Holly.
Hi. Howdy to you too.
He's so Holly, he doesn't even know he's Holly.
So we're pretty much ready for all of our sanding resin coats now, but winding the fin screws in, I've just discovered that this plug is also munted. You can see that the resin is broken here and it's actually high here. There's that little bit of a lip sticking up. You can see the side of the plug. So that thing has to come out now and we are back to square one. Now, I was a young white kid. I grew up in South Australia. I then moved to Europe. I lived in Finland, and that's where I lived before I made that first trip over to Hawaii. I'd been to the States a few times, but this was my first time in Polynesia, and it was really my first experience with Polynesians who, I'm not going to lie, they were quite intimidating to me because they were all quite big, strong, fit, very confident, very brazen, not in a bad way, but just very loud personalities, I would say. And then in particular in the surf out there, I had no idea what I was doing. I certainly wasn't looking cool, and as a young 20-year-old man, looking cool is just about everything, let's face it. Alright, we're pretty much ready for some sanding, resin and some filler for our foam patches. This is the type of job that just, as you sand it, you just find more and more damage. So this corner's damaged, that's obviously needed to be cut out, exposing some foam. We've got damage there. We found that plug, of course, which was my bad, missing that. Another little crack here. More on the tail here that's needed cutting out, so we have a small hole there. And then this one on the rail, which was under the wax, needed cutting out. It's kind of delaminated, so that's cut out. And we'll need filling as well. More cracks around the place, went all the way up to the nose there. This is why, as a ding repairer, I never quote jobs, because half the time once you start sanding and pulling some wax off, you just find more and more, and the jobs always become bigger than initially intended. Maybe not always, but very often. So now I'm surrounded by these 6 strong, fit, local, angry-looking Polynesian dudes, and they start having the biggest go at me, telling me to go home, kook, I'm dangerous, I'm gonna hurt someone, I'm dropping in on them all, blowing all their waves, and the thing I remember them saying the most was, go play in the whitewash, bruh.
Beat it, Holly, buddy. This is our wave.
Oh yeah? But I don't see your name on him.
So they sent me back in, and the whole time my buddy Ethan is sitting behind them. I could see him kind of like giggling to himself. So he stitched me up royally. And although they made it abundantly clear that they wanted me to go in, they all ended up getting waves in shortly after that interaction, my buddy Ethan included, except for one of them who stayed out there with me. And he wouldn't let me get a wave. I couldn't out paddle him, so he'd surf a wave, come back to the lineup, surf the next wave, and I was stuck. So we've got our last foam pour in that plug that I missed, and we have poured all of our micro balloons and screeted those foam inserts. Damn it. Now we've done our fills as well. They've also been left overnight just because we were waiting on that foam. You'll notice with this one, we're still left with some air bubbles, and that's not uncommon. And what you can do is, before we laminate, we could just fill each one of those air bubbles, laminate straight over. but our foam has also shrunk back ever so slightly. Our resin here and here is obviously higher than it will be after we sand, but you can see there is a low spot, so it won't be quite that drastic once it's sanded, but it will still exist. So our foam's shrunk back a little bit when the resin's made contact with it. So because of that, we're actually going to sand this and give it one final screed to fill these air bubbles and level off that low spot. So because this guy just kept backpedaling and snaking me, I couldn't get a wave in. Not that I probably could have gotten a wave in anyway, but I ended up having to paddle all the way back. And when I got back to the parking lot, the buddy Ethan was there cracking up, having a laugh at me. He stitched me up, but also I realised a long time later that I got taught a really valuable lesson during that experience, and it was really with the threat of violence. So usually in a repair like this, we'd be painting the board just before we laminate, but I'm really not confident that I'm going to be able to do a decent matching paint job on this board. The colour's one thing because the ding is right in the middle of that blend, but the thing I'm more concerned about is that texture of the paint. There's just no way I'm going to be able to match that texture because it was sprayed kind of dry directly on foam. So even if I get the colours perfect, this is just going to end up being a really smooth, shiny patch of paint, and it's going to stand out as much as if I didn't colour match at all and got the wrong colour. As opposed to this board, which we're doing at the same time, this board is still painted underneath the lamination onto the foam, but it was painted less dry and probably heavier coats because it's red, and so it's a smoother, more solid colour. There's no real texture to match other than fiberglass over paint. So this one here, which is basically the same as what we're dealing with over here, we are going to paint this before lamination and try and blend it in as best we can. Whereas this one and the foam on the other side of the board, I just don't think I'm going to get a good finish. So although I generally don't like painting on top of fiberglass, especially when it comes to poly, just from a longevity perspective, with the green one, I think we just don't really have a choice. So I'm going to just laminate it as it is, and we're going to worry about the paint job at the very end. The other issue we're going to have painting this board before laminating is, in order to hide it as best as can, because that ding is so big, I'm going to have to blend the paint out really far in both the darker direction, the lighter direction, and all the way to the stringer. Now, of course, if we're painting before lamination, all of our paint has to be under glass. We can't have any of it not underneath the fiberglass cloth, because when we sand it, we're going to expose a kind of weird paint edge which will stand out. So in order for me to do that, I would have to laminate such a huge area of board, maybe something like that, and then we're going to have to send our resin out to here, and then we're going to be finishing it and sanding and polishing it to here. So it's just massive overkill for comparatively such a small ding compared to that massive paint job we'll have to do. Now, it's not like those guys ever actually threatened to hurt me. They weren't saying they were going to kick my ass or anything like that, but they were clearly disgruntled, upset and angry, and they made it really clear that I had blown it, even though I wasn't aware that I'd blown it. And so they kind of had two choices when I think about it. They could have been really polite and said, hey man, you're like blowing it and you shouldn't take a wave when someone's at the peak, and explain the whole thing to me, but maybe I was the type of personality that wouldn't have taken that seriously. Maybe I'm an asshole, so I just tell them to fuck off and mind their own business. Or maybe because they have a relaxed attitude about me blowing it, I think that, oh, I've been blowing it, but it's not that big of a deal, you know. But because they were so angry and threatening, I got the message really quick that what I did was a definite no-no and I shouldn't do it again. And I probably wouldn't have gotten that message quite as clearly, or maybe taken it quite as seriously as I did, if they had ultimately been really polite and friendly about the whole thing. I detected that sort of subconscious threat of violence, and so it made me prick my ears up and listen really intently to what these guys were telling me and take that message really seriously. Now, all of these were Ethan's mates. I didn't realise at the time, but they surf Ala Moana all the time, so they know each other from surfing out there. So I think now a lot of it was played up a little bit to teach the Howley boy a lesson, you know, but it certainly worked, and it certainly taught me a lesson. And I might have a lot of different reputations around town, and maybe even in the water, but I know for sure I certainly don't have a reputation as a snake, as someone who steals waves, drops in on people. Because of that lesson, I was taught very shortly and very sharply in a very small amount of time that day. It helped me as well in life in general, because I grew up in skate parks and I left school at a really early age at 15, and I got an apprenticeship, and so in both of those environments I was kind of accustomed to, if you blew it, especially as a grommet at a young age, the big boys, the adults, they would tell you in no uncertain terms that, hey, you blew it, and you just had to accept that and learn from it. And if you didn't accept that and you didn't learn from it and you bit back and you were a smart ass, well, ultimately you got turfed out of that area. You lost your job, you weren't welcome to skate with the big boys. So that type of life skill, I think, is something that maybe a lot of people lack, and so they can't take criticism from strangers when they get told, hey, you blew it. That hierarchy that existed in skate parks and even in the workplace, ultimately that was taken seriously too, because of the underlying subconscious threat of violence. And I'm not talking like violent beatings, you know, but for instance, at a skate park once, I did something to one of the older boys, and sort of in his 20s, you know, thereabouts, and so they threw my skateboard over the fence and stuck me in a wheelie bin for half an hour to sort of teach me a lesson, you know. They didn't hurt me, but they let me know, hey, I'm bigger than you, and so you better show some respect. And that was before mobile phones and social media, and before everybody knew their rights and all the rest, so that underlying threat of violence still existed, whereas I think now it doesn't exist, because the world is so small with all this technology, social media, all the rest. Everybody knows you ain't gonna do nothing. And so it maybe forces someone like my customer here, not to justify what he did in the slightest, but maybe forces him to feel like he can't just sort of threaten subconsciously to be violent, but he actually has to show that he is capable of being violent in order to regulate. But that of course brings us back to the original point of regulation versus localism, and I don't care if you live in that place, if you were born in that place, or if you were just visiting for a day, you've never been there before. If you blew it, you blew it. And I think it's a really important skill in life to be able to be told under no uncertain terms that, hey, you blew it, and just listen, take it on board, and try not to do it again in the future. Say you're sorry, and everybody moves on. We had a guy here in town at the beginning of the year who got dropped in on at our local bar, and he ended up copping the lip on his head because he had to straighten out when he was dropped in on. He got drilled into the sand, and long story short, he can now only blink and just move his fingers. That's how serious the accident caused by someone dropping in on him was. And it did make me wonder or consider that maybe the guy that dropped in had never been told, he'd never been regulated, there'd never been a sort of underlying threat of violence towards him telling him that he had blown it. And so because he didn't have a similar experience that I had that day in Hawaii, he didn't take the act of dropping in on someone else's wave all that seriously. Maybe he had been politely told in the past, hey, that's not the right thing to do, please don't do that, and because of that message, he didn't take it as seriously as he should have, and ultimately he ended up crippling somebody, which is not something we want to happen to anybody, and certainly not something that any of us want on our conscience. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the whole subject. I could be wrong, it's just how I've kind of always seen it, and ultimately I think it's just worthwhile that if somebody tells you you've blown it, then just take it on the chin and say I'm sorry, and that's it. It doesn't hurt to be told that you've blown it, and hopefully you learn a lesson from it that sticks with you for the rest of your life. Anyway, that was my TED talk, so maybe let's talk about the board, hey? So the only thing I don't like about painting on top of glass is that the longevity just isn't as good. So that red board we saw completed, the paint is all under fiberglass, and that paint job will last for the life of that board, providing it's not dinged in the same spot again. Whereas paint on top of glass, eventually it will scratch, it will chip away, and it just won't last probably as long as the board will last. And that's not to criticize my painting skills or the materials that I use. Even high-end cars, eventually they need resprays, re-clear coats, they get scratched, they get stone chips. It's just part and parcel of paint on top of a surface versus beneath a surface as strong as fiberglass. But ultimately, in this case, and in a lot of cases, we didn't have a choice. So with something like epoxy, for instance, you'll notice that 99% of epoxy boards are paint on top of glass, because paint just isn't very compatible beneath epoxy resin or epoxy fiberglass, so there is no choice. The paint job won't last as long as a board like this, which originally had the paint beneath the fiberglass, but ultimately you just have to work to the constraints that your chosen materials deal you. And that's it, another one done and dusted. Not the job we would have liked to do in a perfect world, but we all know it's not a perfect world. And a good glimpse at how jobs that you think are A, B, and C when they come in actually turn into D, E, F, G as well. Ultimately though, we've done several strong repairs, we've done some proper fin plug installation. The board is going to last a long time, and it's looking reasonably sharp. We've hidden our damage pretty well. It's not as perfect as it once was when it was brand new, but that's kind of the nature of the repair business. A lot of people sometimes forget, myself included, that the most important thing is strength of repair, not necessarily aesthetics. The aesthetics are great, they're a big part of it, but ultimately a strong repair is the main goal. I hope you enjoyed the TED Talk, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, the footage. Let me know what you think on localism, regulation. Are you for one, against the other, against all of it, for both? I'm interested to hear what you think. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers, guys. Chew!